We're back, and a pleasure to say we are joined by Colonel Grant Newsham, United States Marine Corps retired, a man who, in addition to his service in uniform, rendered it to our country as a Foreign Service officer. He's also been a very successful entrepreneur and businessman in Asia for quite some time, and denizen of several think tanks, one there in Japan and here in the United States, our Center for Security Policy. We're delighted to have him with us always. Colonel, thanks for joining us once again here at Securing America.
Pleasure. Glad to finally be here.
I've got an issue that I'm anxious to get your best professional judgment about, Colonel, and that is Xi Jinping, the dictator of China, clearly seeks to acquire Taiwan in one way or another. It's a little unclear at the moment whether that will be through the use of force or whether it will be through other means, coercive, presumably non-kinetic. Also unclear is the exact timing. But I'm very interested in your thoughts about whether his calculations on both the use of force and the imminence of this action has been affected by what he's seen happening with and to his strategic partner, Vladimir Putin, in Ukraine.
I think his calculations have definitely had to be revisited. He, like Putin, Xi was expecting a very short conquest of Ukraine, 3-4 days, and Xi was probably thinking about the same for Taiwan. So after what's happened in Ukraine, the Chinese are going back to the drawing boards. But the important thing to remember is it's not going to make them stop going after Taiwan. They're just as committed as ever. They're simply going to readjust. And the Chinese will say, okay, the Ukrainians put up more of a fight than we expected. Well, then we're just going to hit the Taiwanese much harder. The Russians went easy. So we're going to really hammer them. We're going to close down the entire internet. We're going to really hit them with missiles and our Air Force and our Navy. The Russians didn't do that. They eased up. So the Chinese will do the calculations to just use a whole lot more force. Now, when will this happen? I don't know. I would have guessed sometime after 2023. But after she met President Biden, I have some real doubts now. And why I say that is if you listen to what the Chinese are saying, it's all the Americans are to blame for what happened in Ukraine, not the Russians. The Chinese are providing full support for the Russians. They're attacking the Americans for putting on sanctions against the Russians. There's something about the tone of the Chinese that really is unnerving. And it sounds like they may think that this is their chance to get Taiwan and also to upset the entire sort of Western order that we've seen since World War II. They may see this as their chance. So while I thought it might have been after 2023, it could come sooner than that. But I think you are going to see the Chinese really turn up the heat on Taiwan.
One of the considerations, presumably, for Xi is he's facing considerable internal opposition, apparently. He's looking towards the fall when he will have a party congress in which he expects to be coronated for a third term. And yet that resistance seems to be rising. And I'm wondering, Colonel, whether you might expect to see him engage in what tyrants often do, which is social engineering. Blame a foreign adversary, as you mentioned, us, for difficulties they're experiencing, justifying further repression at home and perhaps external aggression to get people rallying around the flag and the leader. If that is in fact going on, might we see this invasion, this crackdown, whatever you want to call it, on Taiwan taking place between now and the fall?
Possibly. As I say, I wouldn't have thought so if you'd asked me a week ago, 2 weeks ago, but there's something that just gives me a bad feeling about this. As you note, it is the classic response of these kind of regimes when they are facing domestic trouble or opposition to go after a foreign enemy, foreign adversary, and sort of rally people around the flag. It could be the case in China, but one aspect of this is Xi reckons that this is the thing that is going to make him famous in Chinese history forever if he takes Taiwan. And also, he spent a lot of time building up this military, getting it ready to go. And that's something else which sort of weighs in favor of rolling the dice, the way he might look at it. But also remember, he made a speech before the Russian invasion where when he said, you know, Mao going into Korea, it resulted in 100 blows on China and it caused all sorts of trouble, but it was the right thing to do for China. And that is something that anyone who follows this ought to take very seriously as to what is coming
Indeed.
down the road.
Another factor, of course, as we've been talking about on this program a lot, is the consideration that he must have that his old friend, Joe Biden, is president of the United States. There's an increasing concern about the extent to which Joe Biden has been compromised by the Chinese Communist Party. It might also weigh on him that there's never going to be a better moment than having somebody who they have their hooks in running the United States if they are going to take action against Taiwan, where the United States might otherwise be considered likely to try to intervene. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I wish it wasn't the case, but I'm afraid that there's probably something to that. You look at this administration and look at it from, I say, Xi's perspective, seems confused, reactive, sort of ad hoc. And you do have to look at the connections, the relationships that too many of these people in the administration involved in foreign affairs have had with the People's Republic of China. And that is an unfortunate thing to say. So that is, I think, part of the equation. And also consider it as well from China's perspective. Now, look at what has been done to Russia. There's been sanctions put on. They're actually supplying the Ukrainians somewhat, but it's nothing China can't handle. They just might say that. Consider that even while the Americans are sort of at war with Russia and they've put on sanctions, that they are still allowing Russian oil to be sold. The Europeans are still buying Russian oil in the middle of this war. And also, more importantly, remember the Americans are begging the Russians to help them cut a deal with the Iranians. And this is kind of insane. I don't understand it at all. But China looks at it and thinks, well, the Russians attacked Ukraine, and they are still allowed to do business with Europe. The Americans still want their help with Iran, with climate change, of course, and North Korea. So the Chinese may think, well, we go after Taiwan, and yeah, there'll be some complaining, there'll be some sanctions, but nothing we can't handle. And the Americans will still think, well, we've got to have business with China. And there's going to be plenty of people on the American side, who have their snouts in the Chinese trough, who are going to push for that. So China just might say, this isn't a bad time to make a move.
Right. This is the Tiananmen Square model, I guess, where it's business as usual almost immediately, if not actually continuously. Let me ask you about one other issue in your portfolio, Grant Newsham, that we haven't had a chance to catch up on since it happened a week ago or so. And that is an election that I suspect came out rather differently than the Chinese expected. Certainly, many of us did, that in Korea, South Korea, that is, the candidate favored by the Chinese, favored by the current ruling party, favored, I'm sure, by the North Koreans, out-and-out communists, as best I can tell, did not prevail. And instead, we have a fairly conservative, seemingly very pro-American and anti-North Korea president-elect there. Tell us how that came about. I know in the past you've looked closely at evidence of electoral fraud. Was there any, and was it too sweeping an outcome for the election to have been stolen?
Well, just going back to the start, yes, the conservative candidate won, and he's more what you would call somebody who is in favor of the U.S. South Korea alliance. He sees that as what provides stability on the peninsula and has allowed South Korea to develop and prosper. He's also not, he's not in favor of North Korea like the opposition was. He sees North Korea as an enemy. He sees China as an adversary as well, rather than some country to be placated. So it was a very different choice in outlooks on foreign affairs, foreign policy. He won. It was a close election by a couple 100,000 votes, which isn't much. But nonetheless, considering that just a few years ago, the foreign press was all writing how conservatives in South Korea were going to go extinct, that the future was entirely this leftist shift in Korean society. And that has clearly not been the case. So what the Americans have got is a breath. They've sort of got some breathing space to get the alliance back where it needs to be. I'd like to see the Americans also put some attention to helping South Korea's economy prosper, because many people do vote on economics, not so much on foreign affairs. It is an issue in South Korea, but like most people, they're worried about jobs, salaries, and inflation, and that sort of thing. And that's where the Americans ought to help their friends. As for election fraud, that you mentioned, back in 2020, in the National Assembly elections, I was skeptical that anything untoward had happened. But having looked into it, I'd say it's overwhelming likelihood that there was substantial fraud on behalf of the leftist candidates. This time around, there were some suspicious things that happened. And I haven't looked into those in detail, but I have heard from people that I would listen to that there were some problems, but for whatever reason, the other side was not able to produce a victory. So regardless.
It came out right, as far as I can tell. Colonel Newsham, we have to leave it at that for the moment. Thank you for joining us today. Come back to us with updates on all of this, if you would, soon.